He sat alone near the window, thin, quiet, barely touching his breakfast. On his wrist a faded tattoo, a dagger crossed through an anchor. The men at the center table snickered. "Probably drew that himself," one of them said with a sneer. "No vet eats alone without a badge." Another laughed. A waitress watched, frozen. The manager walked over, clipboard under one arm, his forced smile like stage makeup. "Sir," he said, polite but firm, "we've had some complaints. Some guests feel uncomfortable. Would you mind relocating to the patio seating?" The air in the diner shifted. No one spoke, but the sound of silverware slowed. Conversations dropped to murmurs, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Dwayne Johnson, 53 years old, said nothing. He just gave the faintest nod, not out of agreement, but resignation. The kind of nod you give when you've been through this before, too many times. Slowly, he gathered his tray, balancing it in one hand while gripping a cane in the other. His walk was slow, deliberate, each step measured against the creak of a prosthetic, leg beneath frayed jeans. As he passed the center table, one of the men raised his coffee mug mockingly. "If he's a SEAL, I must be the president." Laughter erupted from the table, harsh and cutting. The sound echoed in the silent diner, louder than it should have. "Bean." Dwayne didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on his tray, lips pressed into a thin line. A man used to swallowing pride and pain in equal measure. A single tear slipped down his weathered cheek, dropping onto the tile floor. No one said anything. No one stopped him. The waitress stood behind the counter, her towel clutched in her hands, frozen in place, her heart heavy as she watched him shuffle to the door. The glass door swung open, letting in the cold wind of late autumn. It hit Dwayne's face as he stepped outside, squinting against the chill, scanning the empty patio. He settled at a table near the edge, setting down his plate of now cold eggs, one hand still on his cane, the other on his tray. Inside, the laughter resumed, softer now, but still there, bitter and smug. The manager returned to his station as if nothing had happened. The waitress stood there, her voice catching in her throat as she watched him through the window. The way Dwayne sat alone, shoulders hunched against the wind, his coffee steaming only because of the cold around him. He was a veteran, clearly, but with no fanfare, no medals, no ball cap stitched with units or wars. No one knew his story, no one cared to ask. They saw him, but they chose not to look. And then, at 8:46 a.m., the bell over the door chimed, and a young man stepped inside. He wore a black jacket, his haircut military precise, his posture sharp and straight. He was maybe late 20s, no smile, no hesitation, just a quiet presence that made people shift out of his way without even realizing. His eyes scanned the room, and then they locked onto the empty seat where Dwayne had been, then to the window, then to the tattoo on Dwayne's wrist, still visible, still unmistakable, even through the glass. The young man stopped cold, his jaw tightening, his breath catching. The entire room fell silent, as if someone had unplugged the jukebox, as if every fork had frozen halfway to someone's mouth. Because this young man wasn't just looking, he was recognizing. And what he saw wasn't just a faded tattoo, it was history, it was brotherhood. It was a story only a few men would ever know, and he was about to tell all of us. Jackson Miles stood just inside the entrance of the diner, his boots planted firmly, as though the weight of the moment wouldn't let him move. His sharp eyes, trained and relentless, locked onto that old tattoo on Dwayne's wrist. The dagger crossed through an anchor. It wasn't a mark anyone would see on recruitment posters. It was official Navy issue, an emblem tied to a unit so specialized that most of its files were still classified 50 years later. Only 8 men had ever worn that symbol, and now one of them sat outside, overlooked by the world. Jackson took a slow, steady step forward, then another, the buzz of conversation that had filled the diner minutes ago gone as if someone had cut the power. Even the hum of the coffee machine seemed to quiet, the clink of silverware fading into a shared silence that wrapped around the room. All eyes followed the young man in uniform as he walked past booths, past the counter, and finally past the center table, the table where those four men had made their cruel jokes. When Jackson reached the window and looked outside, the door behind him swung shut with a loud bang, startling everyone in the room. No one spoke, no one moved. From her station, the waitress watched, her heart racing in her chest. Outside, Dwayne sat at the edge of the patio, one hand resting on his cane, the other on the plate of cold eggs. His shoulders were hunched forward, like someone who had learned to make himself small just to survive the room. He hadn't noticed the young man yet, his head down, unaware of the ripple he had caused inside. Jackson opened the patio door and stepped outside. He stopped 2 feet from Dwayne's table, standing tall with squared shoulders. Then he raised his hand in a perfect salute, his voice carrying enough to be heard inside. "Sir," he said, "are you Dwayne Johnson of SEAL Team Bravo?" Dwayne looked up slowly, confusion flickering across his face. The wind caught the edge of his worn coat, revealing the full tattoo on his wrist. Jackson's voice cracked just slightly as he spoke again. "G7, isn't it, sir? You're the one they tell us about in training." Dwayne blinked, stunned, lips parting as if to speak, but no words came out. His hand tightened around the cane, but then, finally, he nodded. Jackson didn't lower his salute. His voice dropped, softer but still strong, echoing in the quiet. "Permission to sit, sir?" Dwayne motioned to the empty chair across from him. "Of course, son." Jackson lowered his hand and sat, his back straight, his hands trembling, ever so slightly. Inside the diner, no one moved. Not the waitstaff, not the guests, not even the men at the center booth whose laughter had dried up into pale, awkward silence. The manager, Todd, stood halfway between the counter and the register, his face drained of color, his mouth pressed into a thin line as he tried to comprehend what he was witnessing. Behind the counter, the waitress stood frozen, her towel forgotten. In her hands, her heart thudded in her chest as she realized who Dwayne Johnson really was. She remembered her grandfather's stories, late-night whispers about legends, about quiet heroes who carried the weight of impossible missions and impossible decisions. She knew now she was witnessing one of those moments, a quiet revelation, unfolding before everyone. Jackson turned slightly, his voice audible enough for the room. "This man," he said, his words clear and steady, "designed the extraction protocols we still use today. He built the procedures that saved lives in the field. That tattoo wasn't bought, it wasn't claimed. It was earned in blood." He glanced over at the men who had mocked Dwayne earlier. His voice dropped firm and unwavering. "If anyone here feels uncomfortable in the presence of a living legend, maybe you should be the ones eating outside." One of the men at the table shifted in his seat. Another cleared his throat, stood abruptly and left his half-finished plate. The others followed one by one, heads bowed, eyes locked on their coffee mugs, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Dwayne Johnson didn't say much. He never did. But the faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corners of his lips, the kind of smile that carried a lifetime of silence. The silence inside the diner was heavier than any sound. As Jackson Miles sat with Dwayne Johnson on the patio, his voice echoing in the minds of everyone inside, the weight of unspoken truths hung like a thick fog. The waitress, still holding her towel like a forgotten prop, felt her throat tighten. She couldn't look away. Jackson's words had peeled back the layers of assumption and ignorance that had filled the room just moments ago. His statement had cut through the quiet. "If anyone here feels uncomfortable in the presence of a living legend, maybe you should be the ones eating outside." And just like that, the four men at the center table had retreated one after another, their bravado dissolved into silence. Dwayne sat motionless, the faintest trace of a smile lingering on his lips. Not smug, but quiet, dignified. The young waitress, without realizing she'd moved, stepped forward with a fresh pot of coffee. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured a refill into Dwayne's cup. Without meeting his eyes, she softly asked, "Would you like some more, sir?" Jackson, watching her with a look of quiet understanding, nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." He accepted the coffee with both hands like it was something sacred. The waitress hesitated, her heart pounding, then reached into her apron pocket and unfolded a piece of paper she'd carried with her all morning. It was an old note her grandfather had scribbled in his field journal, tucked away for years. Inside was a photo, two young men in jungle gear, standing near a battered truck, grinning as if the world were theirs. One of them was her grandfather, James Harrington. The other bore the unmistakable dagger and anchor tattoo. She unfolded the photo and placed it gently on the table in front of Dwayne. For a moment, he froze, his gaze dropping to the image, the lines of his face softening as recognition flickered in his eyes. His lips parted just slightly as if trying to form a memory into words. "What was your grandfather's name?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "James Harrington," she said softly. Dwayne blinked slowly, exhaled a breath that seemed to carry decades of silence. "He promised me once he'd buy the first burger when we got home." She smiled through the growing lump in her throat. "He always said you were the reason." They made it back. Dwayne looked at the photo again, then back at her. His voice was low, rough with emotion. "You have his eyes." Her breath caught, and she nodded, the weight of his words settling like a stone in her chest. Jackson watched quietly, not interrupting, knowing this was not his moment. Without fanfare, without a word, he raised his phone and captured a single photo. Dwayne, the tattoo, the coffee, the folded photograph on the table, and the young woman standing beside him. That photo, Jackson knew, would tell the story the world needed to hear. It wasn't a staged moment. It wasn't for applause or attention. It was a testament to quiet dignity, to the invisible threads connecting generations, to the legacy that lingered long after the wars ended. By that evening, the photo had spread. Quietly at first, then like wildfire. It wasn't polished. It wasn't scripted, but it was real. People saw a young Navy SEAL saluting an old man with a tattoo that spoke of sacrifice, a folded photograph bridging the gap between then and now, and a girl with tears in her eyes. The caption read simply, "Some heroes don't wear uniforms anymore, some still carry the mission." By dawn the next morning, the photo of Dwayne Johnson sitting across from the young SEAL had already begun its quiet revolution. It wasn't the kind of image that screamed for attention. It was simple, almost mundane. An old man with a tattoo, a coffee cup between him and a young soldier, a folded photograph resting gently on the table, a young waitress standing nearby with tears, glistening in her eyes. But that's exactly why it hit harder than anything staged could. It was raw, it was real, and it told a story more powerful than words ever could. Local news outlets were the first to pick it up. By midweek, it had spread from small-town papers to major networks. Reporters lined the sidewalks outside the diner, their cameras poised, their microphones ready, hoping to capture a glimpse of the man behind the image that had gripped the nation. But Dwayne Johnson wasn't one for interviews. Todd, the manager who'd once asked him to move outside, fumbled through rehearsed lines, trying to dodge responsibility as if the weight of his actions could be brushed aside. But the young waitress, she spoke. She shared the truth, her voice steady even though her hands trembled. She told the story of the quiet man with the dagger and anchor tattoo who came in every year on this day, who ordered the same meal, who said thank you and left $1 behind. When asked who he was, she didn't quote ranks or recount war records. She simply said, "He's the kind of man who never asked for anything, but who deserved everything." and those words resonated louder than any medal or title ever could. By Friday, the floodgates opened. Letters poured into the diner, handwritten and heartfelt. Veterans sent notes recalling the legends of G7, the whispers of a man who had once dragged fellow soldiers from burning wreckage, who had made the impossible possible under enemy fire. A flood of messages from strangers poured in, sharing how the photo had moved them to tears, how it reminded them of someone they loved, someone they'd lost, someone they wished they'd thanked. And then there were the crayon drawings from children, simple images of an old man with a tattoo, a smile, and a quiet kind of strength. One note read, "Dear Mr. Johnson, my grandpa cried when he saw your picture. He said you were the reason. He came home. At first, Dwayne didn't know what to do with them. He handed a stack to the waitress, quietly murmuring, 'You'll know what to do.' She made copies, framed a few, and pinned one to the bulletin board by the register with a note that read, 'If you know Dwayne, say thank you. A few days.' Later, flowers appeared on the patio table where he had once sat alone. A single daisy with a folded napkin beside it, scrawled with just 3 words, 'We see you now.' 2 weeks later, the phone at the diner rang. The City Hall wanted to speak with Dwayne Johnson. They'd heard the story, seen the photo, read the letters. They wanted to know if he'd consider speaking at the upcoming Veterans Day ceremony. The young waitress made the call. She hesitated, not sure what he'd say. When he answered, his voice was steady, but there was a hint of surprise. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "If it helps others feel remembered, I'll go." On the morning of the ceremony, the community auditorium was filled with people. Not the usual polite crowd, but a gathering of those who knew the weight of sacrifice. Families with old photos tucked into their pockets, veterans in polished shoes and faded uniforms, kids fidgeting in their Sunday best. They came not because they were told, but because they felt something in that photo, that story. They wanted to stand for the man who had once stood alone. Dwayne Johnson walked slowly up the steps to the podium. He didn't wear a uniform, didn't carry medals or ribbons. His prosthetic leg, worn but polished, peeked beneath simple slacks. His marine tattoo, a dagger through an anchor, was just visible beneath the rolled-up sleeve of his shirt. When he reached the microphone, he looked out at the packed room. His voice, low and measured, carried easily in the silence. "I'm not a hero," he began, his gaze steady. "I'm not a legend. I just did what was right and tried to live quiet. But if what I did helped someone, then I'd do it again tomorrow." That was all he said. Simple, honest, unshaken. He stepped back from the podium, and for a moment the room was frozen in stillness. Then, one by one, the audience rose. Not because they were told, but because it was right. Applause filled the space, but it wasn't loud or showy. It was grounded, reverent, a slow acknowledgement of a man who had never asked for recognition. After that day, something shifted in the town. People who had once passed by Dwayne on the street without a glance now stopped to shake his hand. Kids pointed at his tattoo, asking questions about its meaning. Churches invited him to speak, not to preach, but to share a quiet truth. The auto shop he'd run for years, once a struggling business, suddenly had a waiting list. Volunteers showed up one weekend with paint cans and ladders. They said they were there to clean up, to help. He grumbled, but let them work. The next week, someone fixed the squeaky gate. Later, veterans stopped by with new tools, quietly leaving them with a nod. Dwayne never asked for it. He never wanted a parade, but the town had seen him now. They couldn't unsee him. Late one morning, just before the sun climbed too high, a hum filled the quiet streets of the town. It was subtle at first, but then tires crunched on gravel, and engines idled low. 3 black SUVs and 2 Humvees pulled up to the curb outside Dwayne Johnson's auto shop. The neighborhood fell into a hush as 7 sharply dressed Navy SEALs stepped out, their boots polished, their posture crisp. From the last SUV, a young woman with eyes that mirrored her grandfather's emerged, holding a small wooden box and a folded American flag. Dwayne, dressed in his usual work shirt and jeans, stepped out of the shop, wiping his hands with a rag. His brow furrowed in confusion, but his expression softened when he saw her. She approached, her voice trembling. "Hi, you probably don't remember me." Dwayne blinked, his face lighting with a faint smile. "I do. You have your grandfather's eyes." Her smile wavered, her throat tight. "We came to honor your birthday," she said, her voice cracking, "and to say thank you." One by one, the SEALs stepped forward, each standing at attention, each saluting Dwayne. Then they presented the small wooden box. Inside was a medallion from the Navy SEAL Historical Foundation, engraved with his name, designation, and beneath it, the words, "For service above silence." Dwayne's breath caught. He whispered, "I thought they'd forgotten." The young woman's voice was soft but certain. "We never did." Dwayne held the medallion with both hands, his thumbs tracing the words. The breeze rustled gently through the trees, and for a moment the world slowed. No engines revved, no phones buzzed, no words broke the stillness. Just silence, as deep and profound as his service. Then the young woman, her voice thick with emotion, said, "He would have been proud, you know. My grandfather, James Harrington. He would have been proud to know I got to stand here today and say thank you, not just for him, but for all of us." Dwayne's eyes met hers, shimmering with the weight of unshed tears. He reached out, placing his large, steady hand over hers, and softly replied, "He was the best of us." The words lingered between them, like a promise fulfilled. And that day, in a quiet corner of a quiet town, Dwayne Johnson wasn't just a man with a faded tattoo and a worn jacket. He was the embodiment of a story that refused to be forgotten. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in the town, though not in a way you'd expect. There were no banners or parades, no loud proclamations or grand gestures. Instead, the change was quiet, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. It started with a proposal from the city council, a motion brought forward by the mayor herself to rename the street where Dwayne's auto shop stood. Not after a politician or a wealthy developer, but after a man who had lived a life of silent service. 3 weeks later, a new street sign was unveiled, its simple white letters reading, "Silent Service Way." At the bottom of the sign, small and unobtrusive, was a dagger crossed through an anchor, a symbol now known to everyone in town. As Dwayne's mark of honor, they didn't hold a ribbon-cutting ceremony because Dwayne wouldn't have liked that. Instead, they planted a small American flag beneath the sign and left it at that. Dwayne continued his work at the shop, slower than before, but still steady, methodical. Neighbors started stopping by more often, not just for repairs, but to sit, to listen, to hear his stories. Children brought him drawings of anchors and daggers, and veterans brought photos, some faded and yellowed with time. He didn't talk much, but if you caught him on a quiet afternoon, he'd share stories that felt like legends. He spoke of medevacs that were 3 minutes late, and how he carried men across fields of smoke and silence. He never called it heroism, he just called it finishing the job. That's how Dwayne lived, until the day he didn't. 3 years later, on a crisp September morning, the town flags were lowered to half-staff. Dwayne Johnson passed in his sleep. No pain, no noise, just silence, like always. The town came to a stop. The diner closed early. The high school cancelled afternoon classes. By noon, people were already gathering at the small white church on the edge of town. They came in work boots and military dress, baseball caps and old uniforms that hadn't been buttoned in decades. They came because they knew what he'd carried, even if he'd never said it out loud. The funeral was simple, just like Dwayne would have wanted. A wooden casket draped with the American flag. No eulogies, no slideshows, no long speeches. Just one slow, low song played like a prayer. 6 active duty Navy SEALs, including Jackson Miles, carried the casket. They'd flown in from every corner of the country, not because they had to, but because when a man like Dwayne goes home, you show up. Sarah Harrington sat in the front row, clutching the photograph of Dwayne and her grandfather, James Harrington, taken long before most people in the room were even born. As the service ended, she walked forward, laid the photo gently against the casket and whispered softly, "You kept the promise for both of you." On the headstone beneath Dwayne's name and the years of his life, the town inscribed a single line. He didn't ask for it, they just knew. His silence spoke volumes. His service changed lives. The diner still serves the Veterans Special every Sunday. But now, the corner booth where Dwayne used to sit stays empty. A small brass plaque bolted to the wood reads, "Reserved in memory of Dwayne Johnson, SEAL Team Bravo G7. Some tourists, occasionally, ask who he was, but the locals just smile and point to the street sign nearby. Silent Service Way. Because around here some stories aren't shouted, they're carried forward. One quiet act at a time, one quiet man at a time, until everyone remembers, and maybe, just maybe, the rest of us do too. In the darkest moments, kindness still finds a way. Often it's in the quietest places, through the smallest gestures. Not everyone who helps seeks recognition. Some just need to know that today someone isn't going hungry or standing alone. And sometimes that quiet knowing is enough to change a life. You might forget the story, but if no one tells it again, history stays silent forever. So remember Dwayne Johnson. Remember his quiet strength, his silent service, his unwavering dedication. Remember how one man, with nothing more than a faded tattoo and a folded photograph, changed not just a room, but an entire town. His story is not one of grand speeches or bold headlines, but of the power of quiet courage and the unbreakable bonds of brotherhood. In our world today, it's easy to overlook the quiet ones, the humble, the ones who carry the weight of sacrifice on their shoulders without ever asking for praise. But let this story remind us all, those are the ones we should never forget. And as we close this chapter, let's not just scroll away. Let's share this story. Let's tell it again and again, until the world remembers the name Dwayne Johnson, not the celebrity, but the veteran, the father, the friend, a man whose silence spoke louder than any speech. Hit that like button. Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this, because kindness, honor, and quiet heroism deserve to be heard. This wasn't just about one man. It was about all of us, about how dignity, kindness, and quiet heroism can ripple through a community and change everything. Dwayne Johnson didn't ask for applause, he simply wanted a seat. But what he received was a standing ovation that echoed beyond the walls of a diner. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something deep inside, don't let it end here. Smash that like button, drop a comment below to share your thoughts, and make sure you're subscribed to our channel for more stories of courage and compassion, because together we can make sure the quiet ones are never forgotten.